Uh, so for all the listeners right now, I'll just give you a brief introduction about Professor. So Professor Arun Kumar Singh is an ex-delegate and IFS officer who was also an ambassador to the US, France, and Israel in his long and illustrious career. He also happens to be a visiting faculty at Ashoka University, where he teaches Young India Fellows, including us. And like I was a part of his batch last year and had a great set of learnings from his course. Secondly, right now he happens to be a senior researcher at Cohen Consulting Group, where he does research on market research and related to international relations. Apart from that, he also happens to be someone who's eager to interact with students, people our age, which is why he took out the time and like was very prompt in responding and agreeing to showing up today. So, given the time and given this opportunity, I thought since we've always talked about how in our classes we've always talked about events that have already happened in the past and how certain responses came from countries or foreign policies were changed. We at MindSperm thought that this would be appropriate to discuss these things while we are facing an event like this, which would be talked about in the future. So, Professor, happy to hear your thoughts and your opinion on how the world politics might shape up after the pandemic stops or during it itself. And for all the viewers, we'll just list down how this talk would go. So Professor has decided he'll take 20 to 25 minutes to talk about his own opinions. And after that, we'll spend more time on question and answer. So we already have a list of collated questions that we got from the forms, but we're happy to get more questions on YouTube comments. So please post and we'll be happy to do that. Professor, over to you.
Thank you, Ayush. Thank you for arranging this. I appreciate all the effort you have made and putting it together, calling a lot of people. Of course, as you would know from my classes last year and also my group of students this year, that I normally prefer to keep my classes very, very interactive and operate on that basis. Now here, that's a bit of a challenge since the feedback from the students won't be the same, and I don't quite see them and their reactions as I'm speaking, so that one can judge and modulate the comments and the emphasis as we go along. But that having been said, instead of a straight talk for about 40 minutes, I'll do a 20-25-minute talk, and then we can do the Q&A, because I've always found that tends to be the far more interesting dimension of any discussion. In my own comments, I will more like give pointers because the situation is still evolving and people are still trying to grapple with the extent of what is happening, the likely consequences, how events will play out. Most analysts tend to agree that it is a defining event. I mean, a major health crisis like this, people would say, has not happened at the global level for more than 100 years. People talk about the Spanish flu of 1918. In terms of economic impact, again, there seems to be a broad consensus that this could be as impactful as the Great Depression of the 1920s and 30s, and that nothing in world politics and economy has had an economic impact of this nature, because large parts of the world have effectively shut down, and how people get back to work, the manner in which they get back to work, how activity picks up, is all a bit in the uncertainty domain. Some have started saying that we, instead of BC and AD, we may now have to talk about BC and AC, before Corona and after Corona, as the defining. Very often, as we are involved in our day-to-day life, we sometimes miss defining moments as they occur. But in my own career, for example, in the Foreign Service, looking back last 30 odd years, there have been several events in world politics which totally transformed the manner in which nations interacted with each other and changed the options for countries. One example, for instance, was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Since the Second World War till about 1990, the Soviet Union, the Cold War, the rivalry between the Soviet-led system and the West was a defining feature of world politics. And in 1990s, the Soviet Union dissolved. And after that, the manner in which countries related to each other, that changed. Another defining event, for example, was the 9/11 attack on US, more because the attack took place on the then most powerful country in the world, and it decided to react in a certain way. Other countries have had terrorist attacks, but the US had a capacity to react in a certain way to that. And till now, we are seeing the consequences of what happened as a result of the decision that the US took to respond to the 9/11 attack. And even the US is trying, in a sense, to walk back from all it did since that time. So, defining. So I think the manner in which the impact of the corona pandemic is playing out it will have defining consequences. And it will impact all of you, young people like you who are looking for jobs, who are trying to work out their future, their careers. The world may be very different from the world that you see today. So you will have to have flexibility in how you look at options. You'll have to be sharp in your insights to see what are the trends and therefore what are the new opportunities and challenges that will arise. So what are the kind of changes that one can see at the global level? One important change would be related to China, because for a long time now, the process in a sense started in 1971 when the US reached out to China to sharpen the Sino-Soviet split and gradually start building a relationship between the West and China. Speeded up after 1979 when the Chinese started their economic reforms. The process took another boost after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And then the US brought China into the World Trade Organization and worked to integrate China into the international mainstream. Gave China economic assistance, shared technologies, US companies invested in China in a big way. And the whole approach was that you must integrate China in the international mainstream because the assessment and approach from the West was that a China that was integrated would be a more responsible economic player and that the political system in China would undergo reform, liberalization, more democratization as China became integrated in the international mainstream. Now from time to time, people in the West raised questions about that, but that was the prevailing approach. And that again has had consequences, which picked up especially after 2008, when the global financial crisis hit and the economies in the West for a while took a deep dive, and China stabilized a little better at that time. And at that time, the Chinese GDP was about 2% of global GDP. Today, Chinese GDP is almost 17% of global GDP. And it's 2/3 of the US GDP. So there has been a major transformation since then in the role that China plays on the global stage. And China has become a very important part of the global supply chain and the global value chain. Now, today, people are asking questions. Now, this process had started maybe a couple of years earlier when President Trump came out very strongly, taking positions against Chinese trade practices, against Chinese intellectual property practices. He imposed tariffs on imports from China. And so there was a sense in the West, to some extent, the process had started under George Bush in 2006. Under President Obama, they went back and forth. They spoke for a while of strategic reassurance to China, but later they spoke of pivot to China, pivot to Asia, rebalance to Asia, and started talking about ways to deal with the challenge from China. And this process sharpened under President Trump, because they felt that from their point of view, China was not quite playing by the rules of the game, and it was in an unfair manner accessing intellectual property of Western company, and now was becoming a technological peer and rival for the United States and the West. So in that background, now that this pandemic has played out, the feeling is that China did not show enough transparency in the initial stages of the corona illness playing out, and that there was not sufficient information in Europe, in the United States, about what was happening in China. So if you are integrating China in the international mainstream, and at the same time the Chinese political system does not allow for transparency, which it doesn't, then there will be economic, health, and other impacts in the other countries that are partners of China. How do you deal with this? And in fact, from China, it spread in a major way to Italy, because there's huge Chinese investment in the northern part of Italy, large number of Chinese tourists, there are a large number of Chinese workers there, also spread to the US. So because Europe and the US have been, through trade, through tourism, very closely linked with China, before they could fully realize the significance and the nature of the disease and its spread, they had their own impact. And of course, there are reasons we can find fault also with Europe and the US, but there was this dimension of not sufficient transparency. And I think, so going ahead, this will be one question that will be asked, that will the Chinese system lend itself to transparency? If it does not lend itself to transparency, should the rest of the world have the same level of integration? Or should there be now a more differentiated global supply chain, which doesn't just look at efficiency, but also looks at national interest, security of supplies? Because right now, the security of supply has also become an issue, and availability of various medical equipment. Now, of course, China is trying to address the criticism by claiming that it has, after the initial problems, responded very effectively to tackle the challenge. And now it is coming forward to help other countries that are undergoing this crisis. So that's one. The second set of challenge that will emerge will be related to Europe. For a long time now, European countries have been trying to deepen their integration. And this process picked up in a major way since 1990. After the dissolution again of the Soviet Union, Europe expanded eastwards. Many countries that were former part of the Warsaw Pact now became part of the European Union processes. You have the Schengen visa zone, you have the Eurozone. So Europe has been moving towards closer and closer integration. To some extent, that took a hit in 2008, because when the global financial crisis hit, countries in Southern Europe, Greece, Italy, Spain, they felt that the Northern European countries, especially Germany and some others who work closely with Germany, did not show empathy to the concerns of their workers and their economic situation, and that therefore there was not sufficient solidarity in the European system. So there was a bit of questioning of the European processes. Nationalist sentiments picked up in Europe. But then again, this was sharpened a bit when there was an inflow of migrants from Africa, from Syria. Some countries in Europe were reluctant to receive the migrants, others were more willing. And initially, when the German Chancellor Angela Merkel showed a willingness to receive migrants, there was a blowback in Germany itself, and her own position was undermined. Now, through the impact of the corona pandemic, the European process has been challenged in a big way. Because when Italy took a hit initially and needed help from other European countries, it was not forthcoming. The president of Serbia recently, which is a candidate country for European Union, said in a comment that Europe was absent when he needed help, and that he had written a letter now to the brotherly president of China seeking help. And again, because of the impact of the health crisis, there has been restriction on movement of people within the Schengen zone and within the Eurozone. whereas free movement of people was very much part of the European integration process. So I think with this happening, and you've had rise of nationalist forces in Europe, you've had Brexit, going ahead, the entire European integration process will be called into question. And the manner in which that evolves will have impact on people looking for opportunities in Europe. It will have an impact on businesses that are looking for opportunities in Europe. And of course, some of the European countries, some of the European institutions are trying to respond. For example, EU has now come out with a $500 billion sort of stimulus plan for Europe as a whole. There's also talk of providing assistance to affected countries, including Italy. So all that attempt will be made. But the fact is that there has been a severe questioning of the European process as a result. The third important thing that will happen is the role of the United States at the global level will be questioned. To some extent, that was already happening because President Trump himself, one of the reasons he got elected was that in large parts of the American voting population, almost 40%, there was a sense that the globalization process that the United States had led since 1990, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, to integrate large number of countries globally as part of a combined value chain, economic production process, had benefited certainly the United States as a whole, had benefited a section of the elite in the United States, because today almost 1%, the top 1% of the population in the US generates 40% of the income and 40% of the wealth. But important segment of the population, almost 40%, felt that it had lost out in the process. Its wages did not rise because industries in the US went for investments in China and elsewhere looking for lower wages. Death rates went up, longevity came down, drug addiction went up. And therefore, this segment voted for a person like Donald Trump, who started talking about America first, that each country should look after its own national interests. He started decrying US commitments with its allies, talking about allies must step forward and do more. And so there was this whole effort, especially in the last 3 years under Trump, about talking about America just looking after its own interests. Now, many would argue that this was counterproductive. It was counterproductive because from America's point of view, on a global scale, compared to its competitors, if you look at China, if you look at Russia, its strength lay in the fact that it had a large number of allies and partners, and which the others didn't have at the same level. So, but then if you start criticizing and decrying your alliances, you're in a sense weakening yourself. But he felt that politically that worked better for him. And one of the reasons perhaps where at the global level there has been inadequate response to the crisis is because the only country that could have provided global leadership was the United States, because it is the country that has largest number of linkages, it is the most powerful economy, country with global reach and influence. But under President Trump, US was not interested in generating a global response. It was just looking at the United States. Some years ago, in the Obama administration, for example, when the Ebola crisis had hit, at that time, the US had tried to generate a global response to that crisis. And effectively, after some losses, the crisis was contained. So here, not only was President Trump not interested in generating a global response, global cooperation, but even within the US, for a long time, as most critics have pointed out, his administration was trying to downplay the impact of the virus and the disease, and that things were fine, they would work out, the economy was doing very well. But I think as it has played out, what it has shown is that it is not possible for countries to behave as if they are isolated. The disease has spread all across the world, and international cooperation, best practices, cooperation in terms of availability of supplies, exchanging information on what works, all that is critical. But that goes against really the grain of what President Trump has been advocating. And then, as you can see today, the US has been the worst hit globally. Almost 30% of affected people globally are in the United States. The largest number of deaths are now today in the United States. So it has had that impact. Therefore, the US effectiveness in dealing with the challenge, US providing a global role in a situation could become more difficult going. Of course, some will argue that it depends on what happens in the elections. That if President Trump gets elected, one can see next 4 years, perhaps it go further down this line of American isolationism. But if somebody like Joe Biden gets elected, he talks more about US playing a global role, cooperation. So whether it would change. But even under him, to go back to the pre-Trump era would be difficult, because there are still a large number of people in the US who believe that the globalization process had not worked fully for them. So I think the third thing we are going to see in the years to come, that the global role and leadership of the United States will come under more of a challenge. So we are going to see a more uncertain world. What will be the role of the US? One doesn't know. China, they'll be questioning. The European process is under challenge. And so the question becomes, what does it mean for India? And so it certainly introduces a lot of uncertainty in the situation. To some extent, there will be opportunity for India, because one of the things that had happened is that in the post-1990 globalization process, and in the processes led by and through the World Trade Organization, there was an attempt to spread production globally, lower tariffs, and as a result of this process, manufacturing had been sucked out of India. And India did well in the services sector, but in manufacturing, we hadn't done so well. So perhaps there'll be an opportunity again now for India to see if they can use this occasion to rebuild manufacturing in India, because for some time, there'll be more emphasis on the role of the nation state, of national level production, on certainty of supplies, because given how this crisis has played out, just looking at efficiency of production, maximizing profits, maximizing production may not be the sole criteria by which leaders and countries judge investment decisions. So security of supply, security of value chain will become important. For example, India today is very strong in generics. As you can see, large number of countries have been asking India for supply of hydroxychloroquine, paracetamol, which we supplied to the US, to UK, to Brazil. Other countries are asking. But even though we are very strong in generics, most of the large part of the APIs that we need for production comes from China. And people have been saying for quite some time that for security of production and supply, should you be that dependent on China for APIs? And you have to look at also doing production of APIs in India. So this kind of issues would be questioned, raised more and more. But while doing this, one will have to ensure that the level of technology that is being used is of contemporary standards. Because if that doesn't happen, then again, you'll start losing out. Because pre-1990, there was certain level of production happening in India. But whether you look at the automobile sector and others, the technology of the product and the production processes were not quite of international standards. And then the capacity to compete internationally gets challenged. So but that will be the balancing criteria that you need to use. So that opportunity will certainly be there, and we'll have to see how the government deals with that, because as you'd have seen before this, in many of the trade agreements that India had done, the assessment was that they didn't work out well for us. And the trade agreements, whether we did with our neighboring countries, with ASEAN, with others, we ended up importing more than exporting. And once the Prime Minister Modi's government came in first in 2014, they suspended most of the existing trade agreements and investment protection agreements, wanting to reevaluate the terms and impact on India. So they'll have to see how it plays out. And again, globally, India will have to see how the US looks at its relationship with India and with the world. Because for India, the US relationship is important. It's our largest trading partner. The IT sector is important for India. More than 9% of our GDP is generated by the IT sector. And if the way people live and work changes, as we are seeing now, we are all working from home, doing more and more things online, then the IT sector will play an even more critical role. And the IT sector in India has deep linkages with the United States. So this relationship will again be important. We have almost 4 million Indian Americans in the US. The largest number of Indian students going abroad for studies is to the United States. We are buying more and more defense equipment from the US. Since before 2008, we had hardly bought defense supplies from the US. And by now, we bought almost $18 billion worth of defense supplies with the US. We partner with the US in the Indo-Pacific. We have, of course, the bilateral relationship. We have a trilateral relationship involving Japan, a quadrilateral relationship where Australia also plays a role. So the manner in which US evolves, looks at its role globally, looks at its relationship with India will certainly have an impact. Similarly, Europe. Germany is an important trading partner for us. Britain is the largest host of Indian origin diaspora in Europe. And France is a very strong strategic partner with cooperation in nuclear energy, with cooperation in defense, cooperation in space. So the manner in which European countries deal with the challenge and but another defining issue would be, how does China emerge from all this and its relations with other countries, and then how does it define its role not just in East Asia, the Pacific, but also in the Indian Ocean and South Asia? Because for India, the two most immediate challenges are, of course, the relationship with Pakistan and relationship with China, with which we share a lot. So let me stop here. And my aim was to just flag that there is a lot of ferment, there will be a lot of uncertainty. And the important thing for India, not just for our leaders, but everyone who's looking at how they are defining their life, work, careers, would be to look for new opportunities, seize opportunities, and make the most of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this. This was definitely a very, very important topic for us, and I'm glad that you could share your opinions on most parts of what we were aiming to cover. And this definitely gives us a lot of ground to cover in terms of the questions that we've already gotten. Some of you have already addressed, I believe. And I already have the list of questions divided in certain categories, and we can go through those categories. But from your talk itself, and I was trying to note down on certain things that I would like to follow up on. So we definitely spoke about the hydroxychloroquine tablets, that India is the leader in manufacturing. About 70% of the global production comes from India. But we also spoke about how US, when President Trump came, he was focusing on a more US first sort of a policy. But when India on March 25th and April 4th came up with the decisions to not export, given the constraints at home or for domestic production, there were talks of retaliatory force from US. Doesn't that seem sort of ironic coming from a regime that is focusing on US first itself?
Yeah, so I would say that there are many dimensions to it, to this issue. So first, the relationship with the US is important for India, and we mentioned the various facts. Yeah. And from time to time, when India comes under challenge, be it from terrorism, be it when other countries try and raise issues at the UN Security Council, you need cooperation and support from the United States. And again, it's a very important trade and technology partner. It is the United States that in 2008 did the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement with India and changed international rules, and no other country could have done it, which enabled the nuclear energy sector in India to now expand more and also get the raw materials, uranium and other resources that it needed. So the relationship with the US is a vital relationship. So that's something you have to keep in mind. The second is, as you'd have seen, that the Indian leaders and the health ministry assessed that we have sufficient stock of hydroxychloroquine available in India. Given that, international cooperation is important because certain areas you have strength, but in other areas, India is also importing equipment. India is importing many elements of the what is called PPE, the personal protective equipment, ventilators, masks. We need more and more. So there are other kinds of equipment also to deal with the crisis that India has had to get from other countries. And third is, a challenge like this can be best addressed on the basis of international cooperation. And so talking about international cooperation and countries working with each other to collectively address the challenge is a very important dimension. So I think given all that, clearly there's a lot of merit in the decision that India took. Of course, as you said, that President Trump had said that if India doesn't supply, there'll be retaliation, but that's President Trump. You know, in his public posturing, he does and says things. But once India did send the supplies, as you would have noticed, that he publicly thanked India. And he said that this will be remembered. So that's it. We have to find a way of dealing. But, you know, I'm glad you asked this question because one aspect I didn't cover in detail in my original comments is that multilateralism is today under threat. Because one of the things that has happened is that the WHO has come under criticism. Because a lot of countries argue that in the initial phase, the WHO was accepting the Chinese version and not being critical and demanding more information. And there's been talk of China having today disproportionate influence within the WHO. And that is why the WHO did not challenge the Chinese version. And so the credibility of WHO has been affected. And especially under President Trump's America First approach, multilateral institutions are not seen as effective. So I think at a time when you need global cooperations, the institutions that enable global cooperation have come under threat. And even the UN Security Council, for example, which in the past has from time to time discussed all kinds of challenges and threats, health challenges, climate change, host of other issues, was not allowed by China to discuss the issues related to the coronavirus because China was holding the presidency of the UN Security Council last month and therefore used that position to prevent a discussion because they knew that they would come under criticism. So that's a new challenge that has emerged because for a long time, China, as Deng Xiaoping had said earlier, followed a policy of hide and bide. Hide your strength, bide your time till you emerge. But now China is much more aggressive and assertive in on its positions. And therefore, normally at the UN Security Council, it is the US and the West that used to take leadership and try and push the kind of norms and decisions they wanted. China is now getting more and more assertive about its positions and blocked the discussion so far. But now that they're not the president anymore, the discussions have started.
Yeah. Thank you for that answer, Professor. And I will definitely get back to WHO, and that's a great point that you've raised. And we have certain questions on that as well. But we did have a lot of questions pouring in around, and I'm going to paraphrase that question, around the political system of handling the COVID. So if we see from the spectrum where China as an authoritarian society to India and US as a democracy, do you think the containment of the disease has been more rampant in a, say, authoritarian society like China, where stringent approaches were taken to contain the spread? While in India, we still have a lockdown, but why has US at that point not been able to contain that well? Is it because of the political structure and the underlining how it's played?
So I would say in the case of China, there has been both a negative and a positive dimension related to the kind of system that they have. The negative is that there was a lack of transparency. When the initial information was available related to the disease, they tried to suppress it. Doctors and others who were alerting the authorities, they were penalized, they were taken to task, they were silenced. So the information was suppressed. And that enabled the disease to spread much wider. And the impact it had even on people in Wuhan was phenomenal. For 78 days, then the city had to be shut down. Large number of people killed. So that's the negative dimension. And even today, some of the doctors there who've spoken about the impact happening in Wuhan have suddenly disappeared from public view. The positive dimension has been that once the system decided to respond, it could marshal all of the resources at its command and respond. The kind of containment they did of a whole region and of a wider area. New hospitals were built, mechanisms were enforced. So the authoritarian state was able to do large-scale activity and enforce this decision, which certainly helped in the containment. So that's one dimension. But most people would argue that it is far more effective to be open, transparent, and involve the people in the kind of decisions and actions that take place. I think the challenge in Europe and the US, and first in Europe, was that those societies are not used to the kind of strong measures that were required. Telling people to stay at home. And therefore, the political system was not prepared to take that kind of a strong decision just to order people to stay at home till the crisis took on a certain dimension. And the second aspect was the relationship, especially in Europe, with China. Europe is very heavily linked through trade and investment relations with China, especially Italy. And Italy has now joined the Belt and Road Initiative. As I mentioned earlier, there's large Chinese investment in Italy, including in the northern part. So given that, there was a reluctance to do the kind of sort of measures constraining people and goods coming in from China. For example, in India, we took action very early in March to stop a large number of people coming in from China to contain the spread of the virus. Europe didn't do that. And so that was, I think, partly a result of the European political system, which is more open and lack of willingness to take decisions and forcing decisions on people, and unwillingness to cut down on the exchanges with China, which would have curtailed the spread of the disease, which led to the spread. In the case of the United States, I think it is not so much the system as such, because in the past, the US has responded very well to dealing with crisis. But it has been more the nature of the Trump administration, because many have argued that collective decision-making within the administration, interagency processes, institutional processes have not been working very well. So therefore, the coordinated interagency institutional flow of information and decision-making that was required to deal with this challenge was not there. And President Trump himself, who has been taking most critical decisions, was not willing to acknowledge the seriousness of the challenge. Even a month ago, and there are recorded public comments of his, he said this would suddenly vanish, it will go away, there will be no problem, it will magically go away. So he was not willing to acknowledge the nature of the crisis, and he was also not willing to do any kind of a shutdown because of its potential economic impact. Because one of the successes that he has tried to project for his presidency is that the economy has done very well. Unemployment levels at that time in the US were at historic low levels at 3%. And so he wanted to project that. So he was reluctant to take any steps that would slow down the economy. But eventually, the way the disease spread, he had no option. And today, unemployment in the US is 10%. 16 million people have filed for unemployment just in the last 3 weeks. And the unemployment figures can go up to 20% or even more. So it's had a huge impact on the economy. So I would say that I don't think it would be fair to say that one system or the other can necessarily be praised or faulted for the way it responded. Each had its own challenges in dealing with this. And ultimately, my own assessment would be that openness, transparency, and involving the people in the kind of steps that are taken in dealing with a challenge like this, the kind of response that is required is the most effective.
All right. Thank you for that answer. I'm taking one of the questions that came through YouTube, and the question is: would it be right to presume that after Corona AC, the global political narrative will shift towards universal healthcare and education to be a major public investment and move from defense and military towards these things?
You know, for a while, perhaps there may be focus on the need for dealing with healthcare challenges. But my own assessment, given the past experience, of course, one can argue that the world will change dramatically, etc. But that once this immediate phase is over, unfortunately, people will move on and some of the other priorities will take over. But I think what the current crisis has drawn attention to is that healthcare is very critical. Public health and investment in public health is important if you want to deal with future crises like that. And so for a while, there will be attention. But unfortunately, the way politics works out, the way economic interests play out, my best guess would be that after a year or so, the normal national security considerations would take over, and healthcare will not really replace, defense and other aspects as providing a focus on national security.
All right. So moving to, and I would say this would be the elephant in the room right now, moving to effectiveness of international bodies and their practical use. So we talked about WHO not being as effective, or UN Security Council being under the influence of certain leaders. And I'm relating it to March February 7th briefing by the USAID, where they had proposed a proposal for budget 2021 and reduced the foreign aid to WHO and reduced their investment by half itself. At a time like when WHO already called the pandemic as a global pandemic, US was looking to reduce their investment in foreign aid. Do you think there is a shift towards not having too much faith in global organizations or international organizations?
So that is more, I would say, a product of the current US administration. So at one level, there has been skepticism in sections in the United States related to international organizations. The United States, for whatever reason, many sections there believe that US should provide the leadership role and not allow its options to be constrained by international norms and rules. Now that works with the US when you're the strongest. When you're not the strongest, then you have to work under international norms, rules, and through international institutions. But many others, for example, if you looked at the Clinton administration or the Obama administration, they recognized the importance of international organizations, institutions, and sought to work through them. Now, in today's world, it is a globalized world, given today's technology, communications, and global cooperation is important. Countries cannot live isolated, as the coronavirus has shown. You cannot isolate yourself. More than almost 200 countries in the world are today impacted by this. So if there is globalization, if there is global communication, if there is movement of people, if you need global cooperation, then you need international institutions. Mm-hmm. Now, the challenge is that because of the current US approach of undermining international cooperation and role of global institutions, and also the balance of power in international institutions is changing. because the balance of power globally has shifted, economic and military, and China has emerged more and more. And it's challenging the domination of the West in international institutions and is trying to create more influence for itself in these institutions. We found that in WHO, we found that in several other organizations, FAO and others. So as this shift is playing out, there will be struggle for power and influence over international institutions. So we are going through a phase of transition. And therefore, because of this struggle, many would decry the role of these institutions. Some will talk highly of the role of these institutions. For example, if you look at the UN Human Rights Council, it was the United States that led the process to create this new body some years ago. But today, the United States has walked out of the UN Human Rights Council. And in the UN Human Rights Council, when the Western countries came out with a statement criticizing Chinese practices in Xinjiang, an internment of almost 2 million people, more than 50 countries came out of a statement supporting China, including countries in the Islamic world. And this was a concern related to the Uyghurs in China. So you can see the influence that is playing out at the global level. So as a result of this, the international institutions for some time will not be stable, harmonious entities or places where cooperation is playing out. There will be struggle. So we have to allow for that. But that having been said, where you need global cooperation, you need international institutions.
Yeah, understood. So, Professor, moving to a more centric approach where India comes in, and I was saving this for the last part of the lecture and the talk. So, and we have a lot of questions coming in asking if this could mean a shift in terms of power or like policies being changed and soft power and hard power being used. Soft power in terms of HCQ tablets where India can pose certain negotiation powers, hard power in terms of different countries posing allegations of spread or conspiracy theories around this. Do you think there would be a shift in power or unilateral power coming?
So clearly, the current challenge has also provided opportunity for India. I think the crisis is still playing out, and we have to watch how it plays out in India. But that having been said, there is recognition of the fact that India moved early. India took restrictive steps, including related to China, very early, starting in January, and much earlier than most other countries. Then the kind of lockdown measures that have been taken in India, starting March, again, many have pointed out have been among the strongest and perhaps the most effective at the global level. The number of cases that you have in India are so far limited if you compare them to other countries. So if this continues and India is able to manage this effectively, there will be a recognition of India's administrative abilities and acumen in dealing with challenges like this. And that will certainly enhance India's soft power. The second dimension is related to the pharmaceutical sector, because that's one of India's strengths. And I think with the kind of cooperation that we are trying to build up, again, if we take that further, India should be in a position to build up its pharmaceutical even more. And therefore, India's global role in the pharmaceutical sector can be enhanced. Third, there is economic disruption going to happen. And the global supply chains will change. They will be disrupted. And so there will be opportunity for India to create new space for itself in this global supply chain, so that, you know, for people in India, we have more options. Also, it is clear that I think the way we live, the way we work is going to change. There'll be more and more use of technology. Perhaps more and more people will work from home. So IT sector and related activities will certainly get a boost. And that again is an area of strength for India. And how we are able to capitalize on that and emerge in the forefront at the global level, including in partnership with various countries will have a defining impact. So I think the way we have handled it so far has shown that a democratic and open system can also take hard decisions, can take important steps, and it will certainly create more opportunities for India, given our strengths, if we are able to manage the challenge as we seem to have done so far.
All right. A follow-up question on that. We do see that there would be a disruption in the global supply chains and manufacturing hubs. Do you think there would be an anti-China sentiment in the minds of most countries, given that firstly, China wasn't transparent in spreading the rise of the disease? They could have done that. People could have been more aware. Second, given that the number of cases and how they've contained it, each day they're realizing lesser number of cases, while in certain countries it's just ballooning at this point. Do you think there would be an anti-China sentiment post all of this takes place, and there would be a shift to not just India, to other countries as well, where more domestic spending tries to take place and an anti-globalization sentiment comes in?
So it's not so much pro and anti-China, but I think there will certainly be a lot of more of questioning of Chinese practices in this regard. Because at one level, most countries other than the US are not publicly keen to criticize China. The US, of course, has come out very openly critical of China, also because of the impact they're facing. Also, the US now sees China as a competitor, as a technological peer and rival. And therefore, certainly they would like to use this opportunity to also push back on China. So the US is talking in terms of the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, the lack of transparency. So US taking that lead. The European countries have been deeply impacted. According to reports, one is seeing they are privately very critical of China, but publicly not so. Because they have trade and economic and investment linkages with China. According to reports, the recent G7 foreign ministers virtual meeting, when they were to come out with a joint statement, they couldn't agree on a joint statement because the United States wanted a specific reference to the Wuhan virus, and the other European countries were not willing to do that, and they couldn't come out with a joint statement. So again, that shows a difference in perspective. Similarly, in countries in ASEAN, East Asia, they have been impacted by what has happened, but they are not publicly critical of China as such, because, again, of the economic linkages. So I would say that even though one may not see widespread public criticism of China, there will be critical assessment of nature of Chinese system and what does it mean in terms of impact on other countries. And many decisions will flow from that. And I think as a result, the kind of globalized supply chain that we have, that will be questioned. And more people will be looking at security of supplies, national level production, partnership with countries that are seen as allies and partners, and not just on a completely globalized level. So to some extent, that will happen. And of course, that will come up against the profits of companies, their interest in profits. But even Western companies that had invested heavily in China have of late been critical because there have been forced technology transfers, markets are being shut out for them. So there will be some ferment, but we'll have to see how it plays out.
All right. Professor, talking about, so for each country, this pandemic could have a different timeline of recovery. And this could mean a significant downturn in their economy or how they recover from it. Do you think there could be talks of reparations from China and how that could hold up in an international forum?
I don't think that's a very serious kind of talk. I mean, there have been people have made comments about, some compensation, etc. But I don't think that's really going very far because I don't think there'll be too many countries who would be takers for that. There'll be some talk, some criticism. It's very difficult to quantify all this. And Chinese would argue that they have also cooperated. They have given supplies to different countries. At a time when Italy was not getting much support, Chinese sent in doctors and medicines. There have been reports of Chinese doctors and medicines also going to the United Kingdom to provide support there. So I don't think that there would be any serious move in that direction. Even though, as I said, there will certainly be questioning of globalized supply chains and China-centric supply chains. So some adjustments there is likely to happen.
All right. And I'm taking a question from the YouTube comments. Considering United Nations Security Council's failure, could we see a 11th session of emergency special session?
A special session of the General Assembly or?
The UNS.
Well, again, even let's say they call for a session. Question is, who would call for a session? Would the United States call for a session at a time when it is talking of America first? What is the objective in calling for a session? Who are the other countries? And even though they may want to discuss, what do you want to get out of it at the end of it? Either you come out with a blueprint for international cooperation for that. If not, China is a permanent member of the UN Security Council and it can veto any decision. So nothing will emerge from a UN Security Council session that China doesn't agree to. So one has to understand that if there is to be a session, what is the objective of that session? And again, from India's point of view, the argument has always been that the UN Security Council is not a representative body. It's just 15 countries, 5 permanent members, 10 others. The UN General Assembly is a far more representative body in terms of establishing, sense of what are global norms and or what are the objectives that the entire global system wants to support. So yes, UN Security Council certainly has a role, but in a situation like this, I think from India's perspective, we would certainly not want to overplay that role for the UN Security Council.
All right, Professor. So, final thoughts on this, and we tried to cover mostly all of what we could within this hour that we had. Any final thoughts from your side, and any 3 key takeaways that we can have from this discussion, and what foreign policy could look like in the future for us?
Yeah, so my final thought based on your questions and the discussion that we had is that it is going to be a time of tremendous ferment and change. Things that we have taken for granted will change. And we have to be all prepared for that. What will be the US role in the global context will change. How US companies are looking at investments in other countries, that will be questioned. The role of Europe and the European integration will come under questioning. China's role in the global context, which had expanded tremendously after 2008, will be questioned. So I think many things that we see today will change. And as we discussed, the way we live, the way we work, the kind of technologies that we'll see, the nature of production, people are talking more and more of 3D production. All that is going to change. So it will be a very different world. And I think the main takeaway I would suggest is that people like you should really be alert and looking for the new trends and opportunities. And the guiding factor would be that nothing is going to be what it is now. There is change, and just look for that change and look for opportunity in that change.
All right. Thanks a lot, Professor, for taking out the time, sharing your opinions, your comments on the questions that we've gotten. This has been really, really informative for all of us. And all the best for the future. And I hope this gets past us soon, and India can again get its foot back in the economy, in the foreign policy space, and do well from there. Any final words from your side?
Thank you, Ayush. Thank you for arranging this, and I want to thank you, and also thank your friends, colleagues, and others who had joined us for this discussion. All the best to all.
All right. Thank you so much.